Coming up.
You were quoted saying that when you factor in the fiscal and economic impacts of the carbon tax, most households are at a net loss or worse off. Since that 23% carbon tax increase, can you confirm that it's still the case that most households are worse off or experience a net loss?
I was caught by something a little bit that was unusual in the budget. There were a couple of different tax provisions. One which raised the Excise Tax Act on cigarettes and vapes, and that went in immediately. However, the capital gains inclusion increase was delayed, I believe, until June 25th, if I've got that correct. Did you have any thoughts as to why and what might happen as a result of delaying the implementation?
Well, I was surprised, as you were, by the differential treatment.
So if I were a small business incorporated, I would be treated differently under this new law than if I were a sole proprietorship running exactly the same business. Isn't that unfair from a tax fairness perspective?
That seems to be differential treatment for two businesses that are roughly the same size.
Yeah.
The government has allowed insured mortgage holders to shop at renewal. If you can't shop, you'll pay a higher mortgage. If you can't shop, you pay a lower mortgage. So it turns out insured mortgage holders, or excuse me, uninsured mortgage holders will be paying higher rates for a mortgage than insureds. And if you take it to the logical end, uninsured mortgage holders have put more than 20% down by definition.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Mr. Giroux, thank you for being here. Before the April 1st 23% carbon tax increase, you were quoted saying that when you factor in the fiscal and economic impacts of the carbon tax, most households are at a net loss or worse off. Since this is the first time you're speaking to any committee, since that 23% carbon tax increase, can you confirm that it's still the case that most households are worse off or experience a net loss?
In our reports, successive reports where we looked at the distributional impact of carbon pricing, I think we had in the annexes a profile by year to take into account of the evolving price of the carbon tax or the pricing on pollution. And to the best of my knowledge, it is still the case that most households, a majority of households, are better off once we also take into account the economic impacts of the price on carbon or the tax on carbon.
Okay. You said better off.
Worse off, sorry. Worse off,
important.
sorry.
That's an important.
So, sorry,
Yeah.
I misspoke. It's a bit like the chair's mistake about indicating that Diarra's title is political and sorry, my bad.
After the April 1st increase this year, you are confirming that most households are worse off at a net loss. Thank you.
Sorry for the confusion.
Yeah. The Senior Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada recently said that the productivity in Canada is a huge concern. It's actually in an emergency break glass situation right now. We know that in Canada there's been 6 consecutive GDP per capita decline. We also know that Canada's GDP per capita growth is the lowest in all of OECD countries. In fact, the GDP per capita now is lower than it was in 2018. Do you agree with Deputy Rogers that productivity is in a break glass emergency situation today?
It may not be, I would probably not have chosen that type of analogy, but I agree with her overall assessment that productivity is an essential part of economic growth and success, and it's something that needs to be addressed if we want to maintain and increase our standards of living. So yes.
What factors do you think lead someone to believe that we're in this kind of situation?
Well, the fact that productivity growth in Canada has been lagging that of the U.S. and that of many other European countries, advanced economies, And that is a worry for many reasons. It means that our economy is not growing as fast as it should, and that we are at risk, more than at risk, of losing ground compared to our main competitors and nations with which we trade.
Canada's tax burden today is the 12th highest in the OECD. It's higher than the US, UK, and even the average of the OECD. Would you agree that the tax burden is also a factor when considering in our low productivity?
The evidence on this is mixed. I think more than the tax burden itself, it's the mix of tax, whether you tax labor and capital versus consumption. More like the mix has an important factor, is an important factor, because there are countries with a relatively high tax burden, such as France and Denmark, that do relatively well on productivity. So much more than the overall level of tax burden, I think where the taxes are levied, where from, is probably the most important factor, more than the overall.
Yeah, so to an average Canadian family that's, let's say, going to get groceries, they see high grocery prices or filling up their gas, and when in regards to productivity, would you agree that the carbon tax is one of those impacts on any Canadian's everyday life, or what we say when we say Canadians are getting poorer?
The tax on carbon has an impact on everyday prices, especially those that are heavily reliant on fossil fuels, for example, transportation and heating. So it's something that it's hard to disagree with.
So if we were to axe a consumer carbon tax today, do you think this would have a positive impact on Canadians' everyday life or the productivity that we see here in Canada?
I'm not sure what the impact on productivity would be, but the impact on prices, it would be, we'd expect to see inflation to be reduced. The quantum would depend on many factors, including the competitive framework that Mr. Boswell can probably speak much better than I can. So, but yes, if we were to eliminate the carbon tax, one would expect prices to, if not decrease, at least grow at a slower rate than would otherwise be the case.
The Canada Carbon Rebate makes 8 out of 10 households better off, if I read your report correctly. So can you clarify that this is indeed the PBO's conclusion?
Yes. When we looked at the direct carbon tax paid by household, the indirect carbon tax paid by households through goods and services they buy, as well as the GST that's levied on that, and we subtract the carbon rebate, we find that about 8 out of 10 households are better off when we look at the money in and versus money out. Yes, so that is indeed the case.
Okay. Thank you very much for that.
I was caught by something a little bit I thought was unusual in the budget. There were a couple of different tax provisions. One which raised the Excise Tax Act on cigarettes and vapes, and that went in immediately. However, the capital gains inclusion increase was delayed, I believe, until June 25th, if I've got that correct. Did you have any thoughts as to why and what might happen as a result of delaying the implementation?
Well, I was surprised, as you were, by the differential treatment and timing of these tax changes. So cigarette taxes, the increase came into effect immediately, so we don't want people to rush to the convenience store to buy cheaper cigarettes. But capital gains, we don't mind giving 2 months heads up to those who could rearrange their tax businesses or their affairs so that they can escape the higher capital gains rate. So I don't know why. That's surprising, to say the least. The impact of that is that on the cigarette tax, it's fairly straightforward. It was difficult to escape the tax increase, whereas for the capital gains, it's very likely to lead to a phenomenon where people will sell some assets before June 25th so that their capital gains is all included at 50%, rather than the higher two-thirds rate. So we're likely to see an increase in capital gains taxation, or the taxes collected on capital gains in the current fiscal year, and probably a lower amount, so a displacement of capital gain tax revenues from future years to this year.
Yeah, and I think in the budget they projected just that. Did you happen to catch how much revenue would be a result of this? I'll use the term fire sale for June 25th.
Right now, we just have the government's estimates for the entire fiscal year, and I think they have capital gains tax revenues from this measure at $6.9 billion, if I'm not mistaken.
That was my read as well. Now, this is subject to change potentially. I mean, it's based on behavior. So if, for example, the NDP were way up in the polls and Jagmeet Singh took to the mic and said, we're going to cancel this when we come into government, that could reverse that $7 billion windfall for the government relatively quickly, could it not?
Yes, if there was to be a credible prospect of this change being reversed or other changes to capital gains tax, it's quite possible that those with substantial amounts at stake, they could alter their behavior in the hopes of avoiding this increase or taking advantage, doing what's likely to be most beneficial for them.
And so if, in fact, that $7 billion was backed out of the financial projections, I think that would put the government off two of their three fiscal anchors. Is that correct? And maybe you could comment on that.
Yeah, I think if we were to remove that $6.9 billion of revenues from the revenue side, that would obviously push the deficit higher by an equivalent amount.
Thank you very much.
You talked earlier about the effect of the carbon tax on the inflation rate. You said it might go down if the carbon tax were eliminated, or it just might not go up as quickly. I think I have you paraphrased correctly on that. Bank Governor was here, I think it was October 30th, and he confirmed that the carbon tax at the time added 0.6% to inflation, and that the increase from $65 to $80 a ton would add an additional 0.15%. So after April 1st, I think if you were here today, he would say that the carbon tax adds 0.75% to inflation. And if it were eliminated, arguably, if inflation is 2.9% today, if you got rid of it today, it will go down by 7.5%. It would be roughly 2.1%. Just a couple of weeks ago, during the economic policy report, Bank Governor said, we're holding fast on interest rates. We're holding the policy rate at 5%. What I'm curious about is your opinion on whether or not, if the carbon tax didn't exist and the inflation rate had been 2.1% on that day, wouldn't it have been harder for the governor to not reduce the policy rate 2 weeks ago, saving thousands of dollars for every Canadian who has loans and mortgages?
So that's, I wouldn't want to contradict the governor of the bank on something as fundamental to his mandate as inflation. But on the other hand, I don't either want to suggest what the governor could or should have done had there not been a carbon tax. But it's clear that economic theory would have it that if the carbon tax had been eliminated or didn't exist, inflation would have been lower. Whether it would be 2.1% or 2.5 or 2.8 or 2.9 is debatable, but certainly with lower inflation would probably mean interest rates that would come down sooner, maybe would have come down in April. It's very hard to predict exactly what would have happened.
Let me ask this question. If you were advising the government on economic policy, and I know that's part of your mandate, and they came to you and they said, do you think that increasing the capital gains inclusion rate would make our economy more productive? What would you tell them?
Well, increasing the inclusion rate for capital gains is something that acts as a disincentive, generally speaking, on capital investment. However, what the government did was increasing the inclusion rate for capital gains above a certain threshold and increasing the exemption, the lifetime capital gains exemption for shares in small businesses. So in that case, it's not clear what will the overall impact be for productivity. It may well be that it increases the incentives for small businesses, but decreases them for much larger capital gains. For example, those on the most successful businesses that generate the most capital gains. So it's something that is not as clear-cut because of the inclusion rate increase at the same time as the exemption of $250,000 per year.
But to be clear, the exemption is not available to Canadian-controlled private corporations, many of which are small businesses. So if I were a small business incorporated, I would be treated differently under this new law than if I were a sole proprietorship running exactly the same business. Isn't that unfair from a tax fairness perspective?
That seems to be differential treatment for two businesses that are roughly the same size.
Yeah. Now, just in the time I have left, this business about, very unusual to say, well, we're going to increase the inclusion rate, but it doesn't take effect immediately. It's going to take effect June 25th. My colleague was asking you about this. And, you know, I hate to speculate about the reason for these kinds of things, but it's hard to think of a reason to do it other than the government wanted to incentivize people to sell their capital assets now to generate additional tax revenue. Would that be a reasonable assumption?
If that's not the reason, that certainly will be the effect, because usually you have budget secrecy to exactly avoid these situations, and that's usually the reason why budgets are tabled at or after 4 o'clock, to avoid having impacts on stock markets, for example. So it was a bit surprising to see that the budget was still a secret thing. There was a lockup. It was tabled at or after 4, but still there was a measure, an important measure, that took effect only 2 months after. So there's plenty of time for stock owners and business owners and all that, all these categories of individuals who will be captured by that tax change.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, MP Morantz. And now to MP Thompson, please.
Thank you, and thank you to the witnesses. But I would like to clarify that the Bank of Canada confirmed to our committee in February that the annual increases in carbon pricing raised the average economy-wide price level by 0.1 percentage points.
I understand that you had you received some correspondence from the superintendent of financial institutions recently about a recommendation you had to allow uninsured mortgage holders to shop at renewal without going through the stress test. Is that correct?
Correspondence?
Or there was I believe the OSFI responded to a recommendation that the Competition Bureau had made.
I believe they responded publicly, but to the recommendation that the Bureau had made, yes.
Right. And I guess my question is, so I'm interested in retention rates at financial institutions of uninsured borrowers and insured borrowers. With rates that have gone up very quickly, my understanding is that the retention rates of uninsured borrowers at financial institutions is the highest it's ever been, i.e. they do not shop around. What would be the benefits of having a mortgage holder being able to shop around?
In our submission to finance, we pointed to specific data that shows the benefit of shopping around in terms of the interest rate you're going to pay. When you have the ability to go to different institutions and say, do you want my business? You're going to get competition. And I can't remember, I'm sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head what those basis points were, but it was a certain amount of basis points that studies have shown you'll pay less in terms of mortgages.
Thank you very much. The government has allowed insured mortgage holders to shop at renewal. So if your testimony, I think is logical, suggests that if you can't shop, you'll pay a higher mortgage. If you can shop, you pay a lower mortgage. So it turns out insured mortgage holders, or excuse me, uninsured mortgage holders will be paying higher rates for a mortgage than insureds. And if you take it to the logical end, uninsured mortgage holders have put more than 20% down. By definition, they are less risky to default, and yet may end up subsidizing the insured mortgage holder rate because that pool of customers gets to shop around. Are you concerned about that?
Well, I think from a straight competition perspective, it hinders competition, requiring the stress test and therefore making people stickier to the institution where they have their mortgage now, even in a situation, as we point out in our submission, where it's a straight switch. Everything remains the same effectively. It's just a new mortgage term.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Before I go to my last question for Mr. Giroux, I just have a recommendation, or one final question for you. In your greenwashing, do you expect or have you looked at any claims by financial institutions or the financial services sector about their claims about their products and how they're good for the environment?
Well, what I can tell you is that it's public that we've received what we call Section 9 applications with respect to that.
Financial, like mutual fund companies or financial?
Yes,
Okay.
certainly one financial institution. And so when these, what we call Section 9 applications, 6 residents of Canada over 18 can make a complaint about allegations of violation of our laws, and then we
Thank you very much. I'm going to run out of time, and
Sorry.
I need to get. No, that's
Sorry.
okay. You're excellent.
Okay.
Last question, Mr. Giroux. We've talked about this before. The non-announced measures in the budget. The government released $1.8 billion in this fiscal year in the non-announced measures. I get the need for secrecy and non-disclosure. But why, as a parliamentarian, do I not know how much money is sitting in each fiscal year in that line? I don't know if next year they have $20 billion in that line that they could all of a sudden release, or $2 billion, or maybe $1. All we see as a parliamentarian is the change in that account from update to update. Is that something that you might be able to help us with?
It's something that is of concern to me because there are, as you pointed out, there can be very valid reasons to disclose an amount with an aggregate amount without itemizing it, but not disclosing its changes and items that are financed from this line makes it much more difficult to follow the money, so to speak. So it's of concern.
Thank you very much. I'm going to get in trouble for the chair.
It's all good. Thank you, MP Chambers.
I want to first start with something that a lot of Canadians don't understand, but I think is a direct question. Has Canada ever blocked a merger? Yes or no?
Never through the court process, no.
That's right. And we looked specifically at one case, Roger Shaw, was something that the Bureau recommended to not approve. Is that correct?
That's correct. We sought what we refer to in the competition world as a full block.
It's a full block. And then the tribunal, of course, reversed that decision. One of the concerning elements we saw out of that was that Rogers was able to then sue the Bureau and was awarded about $13 million. Was that correct?
Yeah, I wouldn't describe it as sue the Bureau. So at the end of a litigation process, there's a notion of costs, and that's under the Competition Tribunal Act. And the Competition Tribunal determined that the Bureau ought to pay $13 million in costs, approximately $13 million in costs, as a result of our attempt to block the merger.
You mentioned the Americans earlier, rebuttable structure. We look at the FTC, which is in your counterpart in the U.S. I think last year they blocked 28 mergers, so that they're very successful. We had the Canadian Anti-Monopoly Project here talking about some of the remedies, some ways we go further. Can you just go into detail some more? I know you made some recommendations in the beginning. What does the Bureau need? What more does it need in order to look at merger remedy in Canada?
Well, I think, as I set out in the opening, rebuttable structural presumptions is incredibly important, would be a very significant change in terms of merger law in Canada. And as I pointed out, it's not some sort of magic thing that we've come up with at the Bureau by ourselves. You know, it's been an approach they've taken in the United States for 60 years, including through endorsed at the Supreme Court of the United States level. So that's why we make a strong point about how C-59 could be amended, and we provide very clear language on how it could be amended to mirror the U.S. merger guidelines. But the other point would be the remedy standard, which is, and I went through it in the opening as well, you know, the United States, European Union, United Kingdom, like, restore competition to what it was before when you have an anti-competitive merger. That should be the remedy. And those two amendments, combined with repealing the efficiencies defense, which happened, as you recall, in C-56, those would be the most significant amendments to our merger law probably ever. And that's why we're pushing so hard as the enforcer who sees these things. We're at the coalface every day. That's why we're pushing so hard for these amendments. They would make a big difference.
We tend to look at, you know, when we're looking at what powers you need, we do look industry by industry. We know that you have to look at merger review in law, but also competition law as a whole. We'll look at grocery industry, then we're going to look at airlines, and we're going to look at telecommunications. They all have their unique problems, but certainly we look at the common denominator about how we can solve that. Are there been other recommendations? You're looking at Australia. You've mentioned that Australia does a whole competitive review in their whole government, and the UK. Are there other recommendations you could see looking specific to those industries that you need more power similar to those nations in order to be able to fix competition in Canada?
Well, certainly. I mean, there are a bit of a unique feature in Canada in terms of competition law are carve-outs for certain types of mergers, where effectively our role becomes one of advisor, where we provide our views and to either the Minister of Finance or the Minister of Transport on mergers in those areas that they've deemed worthy of a public interest review. And then the decision on whether to approve the merger is actually in the hands of the respective minister. We've had multiple of those in the transport sector in the last 5 or 6 years, certainly in my time as commissioner. And from our perspective, it's generally a best practice not to have those types of carve-outs in competition law, to allow competition law merger review to review the merger and not to take it out and make it a political decision. And that's just, once again, as I've said repeatedly before this committee and other committees, that's just sort of an international best practice. So that's an area I would flag.
I wanted to come back to something that to Mr. Lawrence's questioning on capital gains changes, and I just like to correct something that he implied. So the 10-week delayed implementation of the capital gains tax change that he alluded to, the 10-week delayed implementation of that is intentional. I understand, and actually it's consistent with what past governments have done. So, for example, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney did something similar when he was Prime Minister and had a delayed implementation. And importantly, the current revenue projections in the 2024 budget are built on the understanding that there is this delayed implementation of this tax change, and therefore that and the delay allows folks who are impacted to dispose of assets if they so choose to in that 10-week period, which was, I think, as Mr. Giroux indicated, that would provide them with a 10-week period approximately of time in which those who are impacted by this could choose to dispose of assets, in which case they would be the tax implications would be based on the current calculation of the capital gain. So I wanted to simply clarify that for the record, that it was intentional, and it opens up the opportunity for people who are touched by this to act under the current tax regime rather than the proposed new one. The other thing I wanted to say was that there's been a fair bit of discussion about carbon pricing in our committee, and sort of the cost of climate change on our economy. We've asked you, Mr. Giroux, if you would consider looking at the implications of climate change on our fiscal balance sheet as well. I mean, to me, one of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about when I think about action on climate change, and I think about what are the costs of climate change to our economy, to our quality of life, and then what are the costs of the actions we must take, and weigh those two things against each other. And I guess one of the things that I wanted to point out was, we've talked with my colleagues, and I have mentioned that the Bank of Canada governor spoke to the fact that the increase in the carbon pricing would have approximately one time 0.1% impact. But he was also asked, I recall, at our committee, I believe by my Conservative colleagues, what the implications are of the overall carbon tax on inflation. And at the time, if I recall correctly, he said if you eliminated the carbon tax completely, that there would be a one-time, I think it was 0.6% reduction in one time, not every year, just at once, right? And so that, and what I think is important to remember is that although that 0.6% is no doubt helpful to Canadians, it's important to remember that this would only take effect in that 1 year, and then after that, inflation would return to whatever it would have been otherwise. But the other piece of it is that there's a cost to that, to all of us, of climate change and not acting on it. Mr. Giroux, I wonder whether you have any thoughts on whether it's, and the last thing I'll say is we've had experts come to this committee and speak about how we had an expert on food pricing, for example, come and speak to us, who talked about how, when I asked him what the major reasons were for food inflation, he indicated that the primary reason was extreme weather events, a significant portion of which are impacted or driven by climate change. And he also spoke about the war in Ukraine and the geopolitical impacts of that. So if the food inflation that Canadians are feeling, which has been significant, far greater than 0.6% of an increase every year over the past number of years, is driven by extreme weather events, which are largely driven by climate change, then surely the cost of not acting on climate change is greater than the one-time 0.6% cost of acting. Would you agree with that, Mr. Giroux?
Well, the question of food price inflation is a very complex one because it involves many factors: trade barriers, extraordinary world events, supply chain disruptions. So whether climate change has a greater impact than 0.6% on food price inflation in any 1 year, I think is something that's up for debate, and I'll let people who are specialists in the agriculture or agri-food sector debate that. So you've had experts on price food and the price of food and inflation. I'll probably let them speak on the impact of climate change and the carbon tax rather than pronounce myself, because it's an area that's highly specialized.
Thank you, MP Baker.
This guy's
Without further ado, I'll turn things over to you.